introduction, and thank you very much for having me. Unfortunately, I can't be there in person. I was supposed to, but yeah, it didn't really work out because despite being vaccinated, I got the virus the day before I was supposed to travel there. So yeah, it's really unfortunate, but I'm still happy to be able to present it like this today here. So the general topic that I want to talk about is like this distinction between additive and transformative rationality, and kind of as an approach to the difference between animals and human beings, or rational and non-rational animals. And more specifically, I will talk about Matthew Boyle's discussion of these two approaches to the structure of rationality. So the plan is that first, I will say a few words about the two views in general. Then I will present a specific way of understanding the distinction between additive and transformative views that I personally find interesting. I will then take a look at Boyle's own transformative view and argue that it's not necessarily incompatible with the other view that I presented before. Then finally, I want to argue that Boyle's own view should and can be spelled out further. And doing this would lead to a more nuanced picture on which additivity and transformativity are, in a sense, on a spectrum, and there is a possibility of overlap. So let's start with a general characterization of the two approaches. So according to additive theories of rationality, rationality is just a capacity that is kind of added to, or it sits on top of these older, from the evolutionary perspective, these older capacities of believing on the basis of perception and acting on the basis of desire, as Boyle calls them. And in what follows, I will not necessarily refer to the capacities, but I will talk about perceptual and motivational states. And as far as I can tell, Boyle in his paper about this also switches around between talking about the states and the capacities. I don't think much hinges on this, but if you can find something that would be an interesting comment later, or something, if you see that there is something that I would have to pay attention to, that would be good to hear. So a distinctive feature of additive views that Boyle criticizes is this kind of horse and rider structure of these perceptual and motivational states that I want to talk about, and I will abbreviate those as PAMs. So he criticizes this horse and rider structure of PAMs and rationality, where perceptual and motivational states we share with non-rational animals are kind of a mere input for rational capacities and kind of distinct from them. In contrast to this, Boyle argues that that rationality fundamentally changes the nature of perceptual and motivational states that rational beings have. And on this view, rationality, he writes, gives us a special form of perceptual sensitivity to our environment, one whose operations are themselves informed by our capacity to weigh reasons. So on this picture, PAMs, these perceptual and motivational states, are of a distinctive kind, and they're not shared with non-rational animals in the same way that they are on additive views. And I think an analogy between with the difference between animals and plants that Boyle himself makes in an earlier paper can make this clearer. So one might say that plants like sunflowers do something when they turn their heads towards the sun, and animals might also turn their heads towards something they hear or something like that. However, Boyle notes, and I'm quoting him again, that it is not merely that an animal can do more than a plant, it is that talk of doing can apply in a wholly new way to an animal. And the same thing holds for non-rational and rational animals. rational animals have perceptual and motivational states in a different way than non-rational animals do. So Boyle in his paper argues against additivism on a certain type of reading, and it feels like he seems to be taking this additive view in general to be, or additivism in general to be refuted by this, because he ascribes this view to different philosophers and in different contexts. I think that Boyle's view about what a certain cognitive system looks like when you add rationality to it is not necessarily in conflict with certain other approaches to additive views, or just in general different perspectives. And I want to present, first of all, a general criterion with which we can distinguish transformative and additive views, and then I want to characterize an additive view, or a possible perspective in which there is an additive view that is compatible with Boyle's specific conceptual transformative view that I will discuss later. I'm going to skip over this diachronic reading because there's not that much time. And I want to focus on, because there seems to be transformation and addition or additivity seem to indicate something diachronic, but that's not what Boyle actually discusses. So I want to focus on these synchronic readings that are about what a state of a cognitive system is like once rationality has been added, and there is this addition in there that we're just going to bracket for now. So from the evolutionary perspective, that the rational part of our neural systems was in a sense added to earlier systems, it's just an indisputable fact, because we were rational, our evolutionary ancestors were not rational, and we now are. But where the debate really lies is in the question what these earlier systems look like once rationality is added. And this synchronic understanding is what Boyle has in mind. So he wants to argue that after adding rational capacities, the earlier, more basic functions are no longer the same. They have been transformed. So you can't take your animal PAMs as your input for your rational systems. So what allows us to tell whether rationality is additive or transformative is not in this development, but is in a question whether we have the same mental states as, or whether we have our perceptual and motivational states in the same way as non-rational animals. So I want to put this in terms of an identity thesis that would say, or with which we can differentiate between additivists and transformativists. And this identity thesis just says that some of the perceptual and motivational states of non-rational animals are the same as those of rational animals. So on an additive view of rationality, we share the way we perceive the world and desire things with non-rational animals, at least to some extent or in some way. But what distinguishes rational from non-rational animals for additivists is this addition of these monitoring, rational, reflective capacities that allow us to consciously consider perceptions and desires as reasons for beliefs, and then to judge on the basis of these considerations. According to transformativists like Boyle, it's not the case that perceptual and motivational states are shared with animals, because they are transformed by having rational capacities. So they would hold that this identity thesis is false. And then one way to apply this criterion, or just to throw something at it and to see what sticks, is to see how similar the underlying neurological states of rational and non-rational animals are. So while, again, Boyle's distinction is not about the development of these cognitive systems and evolutionary history, like I think still the facts about our evolutionary history are often taken to suggest that there are, to some extent, distinct neurological systems corresponding to phases in development. The old ones we have in common with our evolutionary ancestors, and newer systems that underlie higher cognitive capacities. So, and according to this popular model, though it's not popular among scientists, there are three functionally differentiated areas of the brain: the reptilian, the paleomammalian, and the neomammalian complex, that have developed or that correspond to different stages in development. And I think this suggests an additive empirical view, where these lower order capacities are shared with animals and the other things are just added. But it's dangerous to take these ideas too far and really apply this triune model as a motivation for additive theories or this empirical perspective on additivity, because the triune model, Robert Sapolsky notes, and I'm quoting here, leads one erroneously to think that evolution in effect slapped on each new layer without any changes occurring to the ones already there. So a transformative view is not really excluded by this specific empirical perspective, as there is, and this is again a quote, there is considerable overlap among the layers. So even empirically, it seems like the addition of these, or the development of the higher capacities has changed something and has transformed the lower capacities, or neurologically, the lower parts of the brain. So despite the implausibility of this triune model, though, I think there are considerations that speak in favor of an empirical additive view. Because I assume that there are parts of our brains that we share, at least to a large degree, with non-rational animals. And even moving away from the neurological perspective, if we look at how we learn about ourselves by studying animals, I think that this makes sense only if there's some commonalities or enough commonalities in the cognitive capacities that we have with animals for this to make sense. Also, a note on Boyle's claim on how we use these terms, which will become important later again, because he would say that when we talk about cats as seeing birds and dogs wanting to catch the stick, we use see and want differently than when we say that a human being sees or wants something. And I think the fact that this difference in meaning isn't an obvious one indicates that, or like, if we asked people whether they use the term differently, like they feel like they use the term differently, they wouldn't say that they do. So pre-theoretically, that we share many mental states with non-rational animals seems to be deeply ingrained in our folk psychological concepts of perceptual and motivational states. And of course, we shouldn't stop there. This is subject to questioning, but at least it explains why this seems to be such a common view. What's important, though, is that this is, like, from this empirical perspective, it's of course an empirical question, and I think it is one that will remain unanswered for quite a while. But the important thing is that I believe that any answer to this question, this empirical question, is compatible with Boyle's own transformative view, which is distinctly philosophical. So if somebody argued for an empirical additivism, Boyle's argument wouldn't necessarily work against this view. So I forgot to scroll down here, sorry for that. So the next point I want to make is, or the next question I want to ask you, what Boyle really has in mind. So I'm quickly going to look at the background of his view and then try to characterize a little bit more in detail, and then go to my own spelling out of my own development of this. So Boyle's transformative conception, or his view that PAMs in rational beings are not the same as those in non-rational ones, rests on McDowell's view about the relation between the conceptual content of PAMs and rational capacities. So very broadly, Boyle claims that if this identity thesis I discussed earlier is true, then there is an interaction problem between perceptual and motivational states and rational capacities. So the argument is that rational beings cannot share their PAMs with animals, because if they did, these would be non-conceptual or not conceptual in the right way, and they could not be subject to reflective scrutiny. But rational beings are able to reflect, are able to believe and act on the basis of reasons considered as such, which would not be possible if these PAMs were like those of non-rational animals, not conceptual in this sense. So there's lots of questions that arise from this argument, and lots of assumptions that are made, and lots of background that would be very interesting to go into, but that I neither have the time nor the expertise to go into. So I'm just going to see how Boyle's transformativism follows from this. So making sense of Boyle's view that follows from these considerations relating to conceptual and non-conceptual content, I think involves looking at what the terms perception and desire mean, and whether this meaning is independent from rational capacities. So I take this because he writes, quoting, for what if perception, if what perception signifies in the case of rational creatures cannot be explained without reference to the capacity for rational reflection, then rational perceiving cannot be explained as perceiving supplemented by the further power to monitor and regulate this activity in the light of reasoning. And this conceptual reading comes through more clearly in his earlier paper from 2012, where he writes that, so when we speak of the goal-directed acts of an animal, we are clearly speaking of agency and goal-directedness in altogether different register. So this is already, I've mentioned this already earlier, the terms doing just apply differently to animals. So, and in contrast to this, I assume that Boyle would characterize additive theories as claiming that the meaning of perception in the case of rational creatures can be explained without reference to rational capacities. So because we are able to reflect on our perceptual and motivational states, this means that the contents of these must be conceptual in the right sense. There's nuances in there that I've had to skip over. Thus, human beings and non-rational animals do not have the same kinds of perceptions. So yeah, this is what follows from this interaction problem. So what I personally find lacking, or what I find where I think this could be further developed, is that it should give an explanation of why being conceptual should make it that these perceptual and motivational states are of a fundamentally different kind, and why saying that these are completely different because they're conceptual and non-conceptual, why this isn't ad hoc. Because like, even if this interaction problem, this argument from the interaction problem is successful, and I want to leave it open whether it is, my question is, how does this relate to what the words mean? And of course, being conceptual in one case and non-conceptual in the other is a significant difference between the perceptual and motivational states of non-rational animals and rational animals. But I wonder whether, like, how do you, why is it significant enough, or where do we draw the line? For example, is the fact that reindeers see UV light a reason to believe that their perception is fundamentally different from perceptions of normal deer? I mean, a possible reply might be that this is just a difference in content, and it's not a categorical difference. It's not significant enough. But my point is that Boyle doesn't explain this, why being conceptual and non-conceptual makes this shift in meaning. And I think it's not just trivial. I think it's not necessarily the explanatory bedrock of why these terms have shifted their meanings. And in fact, I think that there are good reasons to believe that it is not the bedrock, because there's a rich body of theories about how mental states terms get their meaning. And that is what I want to focus on now. I believe that functionalism can serve as a useful framework for understanding a transformative understanding of rationality. So one way to make sense of transformativism then on this framework is to consider the functional roles of that mental states play and how these roles differ in different cognitive systems. So I have an illustrative case here. So Kim and Rio, this is also on the handout. I'm gonna have to scroll between there. So Kim and Rio are both looking at an apple. Kim is human and Rio is a capuchin monkey, and assume, and this is very probably false, it's almost certainly false, that the neurological correlates of the perceptual states of Kim and Rio are sufficiently similar to be called identical in a kind of structural way. So let's say that they are not more dissimilar than the states, the neurological states of two human beings. In a sense, this suggests an empirical additive view of rationality, because Kim is rational, Kim can reflect on this, and Rio isn't. Yet they are in the same, or in a sufficiently similar in the right way, neurological state. However, even if the neurological correlates of these states are as similar as we assumed for the sake of the case here that they are integrated into very different overall functional systems. So Kim's perception of the apple might make her wonder who put the apple there, and whether she feels like eating the apple or not, and that she really should eat the apple because she doesn't eat well. And all of this will then inform her decision to eat the apple. And it might not do this. The thing is that it is related to these different functions. Rio, on the other hand, will probably just grab the apple and have a good meal. He does not have this capacity to reflect on his desire and his reasons for eating it. So I think this approach, in terms of functionalism, has the advantage of cutting across the previous discussions of conceptual and non-conceptual content, and also another discussion between like the actual activity of reflective capacities, or the capacity, whether the capacity has to be kind of involved. I've skipped over that for time's sake. But I think this functionalist approach offers a deeper understanding of why one might consider the terms for these mental states to have shifted in meaning when applied to rational creatures. Because if we take the functionalist approach to the identification of mental states, being integrated into different functional systems will make a difference to what these states are. And if the functional role of a possibly neurologically identical state is sufficiently different from another one, it is, for all intents and purposes, a different mental state. So I think this framework allows for degrees and different conclusions about whether perceptual and motivational states are transformed or not, depending on how widely the functional net is cast, so to say. Depending on how far we look into different, like into this nexus of functional and causal relations, we get different conclusions. However, taking this too far into a kind of holism might lead to problems in relation to the identification of mental states. So Janet Levin discusses something like this in relation to the mental state of pain. So if pain, for example, is interdefined with, and I'm quoting here, and probably should also, so if pain is interdefined with certain highly articulated beliefs and desires, then animals who don't have eternal states that play the roles of our articulated beliefs and desires can share our pains. And humans without the capacity to feel pain can share certain or perhaps any of our beliefs and desires. So in order to avoid the result that perception of one human being are fundamentally or dramatically different mental states from those of a different human being, limits have to be placed on which functional roles should matter when identifying a mental state and which should not. Because and there is a further sense in which this additivity comes in. Perceptions of rational animals and perceptions of non-rational animals are all perceptions, and this is also something that Boyle would grant, I think. So in a sense, there has to be a set of shared functions that are fulfilled in the two cases. So yeah, this goes into a different direction. It's from what Boyle suggested. But I think the advantage is that this approach, or this functional approach, works in a bit bigger explanatory framework. There is all of this theoretical material that we can work with, and it's a bigger picture than just the fact that non-rational perceptual and motivational states are non-conceptual. So I'm quickly going to wrap up. So what I intended to do is mainly to clearly distinguish ways in which one might understand rationality to be additive or transformative. And I think in that even in that respect, to a single criterion that I formulated the thesis. I think even in relation to this single criterion, this identity thesis, the empirical and conceptual perspectives are to some extent independent, so we can get different results in these two different areas. Then after trying to pinpoint like the central claims of Boyle's view, I've argued that this view should and can be spelled out further, and I've tried to do this in a functional framework, and came to the conclusion that whether a transformative or additive reading of rationality is more plausible depends on the restrictions that need to be placed on the functional analyses of these states or capacities. So, thank you.
Thank you, Yannick. I hope you heard the applause.
No, I didn't, but that's okay.
Well, we can try it again. But there was.
I think the noise canceling is just too good.
Oh. So I'm going to first monkey around here with the. Nope, you should be just fine. Oh, just fine. Can we see people in the out in internet land? So anyone who talks will show up on that window. Yes, but how will I know to call on them? Oh yeah. So would you stop sharing screens yet so we can see the chat box?
Sorry, Yannick, would you stop sharing screens so that we can see the chat box?
Yep.
And then we'll do what we did last time. So those who are participating remotely, if you have a question, just enter Q into the chat box and we'll do it that way.
All right. From the floor, and it looks like Jeremy has a question.
Hi, thank you, Yannick, for that interesting talk. Feel free to defer this question if you think this takes you too far afield. But I wonder, there seems to be a presupposition to your talk that the transformative conception, the difference you have to find at the level of the PAMs has to be somehow empirically describable. And I wonder why we can't just say that the transformation is normative rather than empirical. I mean, you know, when an animal makes has a mistaken inference, like, you know, there is smoke, therefore there is food, that's an error, but the only form of correction that the animal is subject to is like dying or something. Whereas, you know, humans, when we acquire rational capacities, the way in which this manifests itself is that we now have access to a meta language in which we can formulate inferences using logical vocabulary. You know, we can make what Sellers calls Aristotelian inferences, you know, wherever there is smoke, therefore there is fire. And so now we can become subject to a different kind of correction, which is normative correction from other sorts of people. We can be subject to normative critique. And so there's an additional kind of correction that we're subject to, which is, this kind of correction. So we're accountable in a different way. We're not just accountable to the world, but we're accountable to the community of rational beings if we infer in a faulty way at this lower level. And of course, this lower level has to gear into the higher level, because one of the things that the higher level allows us to do is to revise these lower level tendencies and capacities to make inferences. But the most interesting way in which these higher level capacities transform the lower level capacities is not strictly a functional one, it's a normative one in terms of accountability. And it seems like that's actually the most interesting way in which the transformative conception of rationality is characterized. It's not functional, it's normative.
Okay, yeah. It's a very interesting point. Thank you for that. I think it's definitely something that would be very interesting to look into, but I don't think it's the point Boyle wants to make. Like in the paper, it really seems like what it's about is really what those mental states are. Yeah, I'd have to think about that, whether this is really what he would have in mind, because my assumption, or I've been starting out from basically the framework, or at least what I feel like are the assumptions that he made. But definitely looking at the normative perspective, there are different what do you say? There are definitely different implications of our normative capacities, if we can call them like that, on these lower order, on these lower capacities that animals have. So yeah, maybe something like a normative transformation would be possible. But as you mentioned, like, it was my assumption that, or part of the assumption of this talk was that it was really about whether they are really different, just different mental states from kind of maybe empirical perspective. Yeah. But thank you.
Looks like Hillary has a question.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm quite sympathetic with your critique of Boyle. But as I remember, his paper starts this way, and maybe I'm confusing it with one of his other papers on this topic, but he starts by saying, not only comparing the additive and the transformative view, but by saying there is this other view, namely that that the so-called non-rational animals are actually rational as well. And he says he's not going to discuss that. He's just going to compare the additive and the transformative views. But I'm wondering why, given your critique of his transformative view, you don't go over to that third view yourself. Why it is that if the mental states are not transformed in the way that Boyle suggests, we shouldn't see young enough children, various other animals as rational as well. They're reason responsive, just as we are. We're more complicated reasons responsive creatures than they are. But there's no reason, once you take the kind of functional view that you're suggesting, for drawing the line between the rational creatures and the non-rational ones, what Boyle does.
Yeah, thank you for that. That is actually something that I often stumbled upon while working on this, and I think one place to build this in, or to look at this, is in Boyle's argument, where the assumption just is that, or well, it's not necessarily an assumption, but where, because he starts from McDowell's, from this perspective, I think there is this kind of view that it has to be conceptual in the right way, and animals just don't have that. That being conceptual in that sense that he wants, or he talks about, is just linked to rational capacities. And if you don't have rational capacities, you don't have these conceptual capacities in the right way. And that is something that I wanted to skip over, because it goes very, I'd have to talk about the whole McDowellian framework that I'm not familiar enough with, that I could say a lot about it. And I wanted to start with, or I wanted to attach or start with my functional perspective a little bit later, where even if this were the case, I could still kind of explain the difference. On the other hand, I think it could be put in, or it could be this question, or this perspective could be applied when we set these limits for which functional roles we take into account, because it either happens that there is a kind of transformation while a child grows up, because the functional roles of certain states change while we live. Like as a very young child, I mean, the functional roles of perception and motivational states might be similar to those of Rio, our capuchin monkey here. And then when we grow up, these new roles develop, but we wouldn't really want to say that during our lifetime, we perceive things in fundamentally different ways. Or I don't know, maybe we would, but if we start out from the assumption that we just perceive and these other capacities become attached to it, that sets limits to which functional roles we can take into account. So there is space, I think, for this view, but yeah, the view that rational, that what he calls non-rational animals are actually rational to some extent. Yeah, I in a sense, I wanted to start. I wanted to skip over that, and on the other hand, I think there is space, in my view, to account for this.
Okay. Yes, in front.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. So, can you hear me?
Yes, it's a little bit lower volume, but I think it's okay.
Okay. Cool. So this is related to Hilary's question, I think. I was wondering whether you have been a bit too charitable with Boyle at one point. Okay. You suggested that the fact that people tend to ascribe beliefs, desires, perceptual states to animals doesn't show that they have them, right? But I was wondering whether a stronger argument than that could be made, namely that it's not just people that ascribes those states to animals, it's the people who studies them. So it's inference to the best explanation when you study their behavior, and mental states turn out to be ineliminable when you are describing their behavior. And if that argument is there, do you think that Boyle still has a way of saying, no, this is philosophy that doesn't bother me? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good question. I think I would have to ask Boyle. I wouldn't want to interpret his intentions too much. I think he might just say, yeah, that works on a different level. That's just empirical, and I'm talking about a conceptual philosophical relation here, but I'm not sure. Like, to me, this empirical perspective has a lot of weight, and I think it has weight that it might not have from if you look at his perspective. But I don't know whether he would then feel pressure to make an amendment to his view because of this difficulty. I don't know. Sorry.
Further questions? Anything from the internet? Did Ulf have something?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering whether playing the role of a reason or of a supporting consideration or something like that, basis of a belief, is a functional role for you. The question is, because I'm thinking that that is one thing that Boyle is after. He thinks that for us, our perceptions and desires can play the role of reasons in some sense. And he thinks that that's not the case for the animals because they are not rational. So if you include those as functional roles, I think, it's clear that then yes, you can describe them in a general way. And there's some of these functional roles will be reasons, like roles of reasons, and others won't. But I'm a little bit worried that at that point, Boyle will say, look, that was what I was talking about, that this is very different, really a very different role. The role of something as a reason and the role of something as merely a functional role in terms of causation are very different things.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure whether I completely understand. What I was mainly, or what I wanted to talk about was that the mental states are identified by their roles and defined in that sense. There is some difficulty, I think, or something that would have to be made clearer is whether there's like this psychologistic assumption that perceptions and the mental states are the reasons. Usually I try to, like, I took this over from Boyle, but I would usually say that facts are reasons, or that factualism. But so maybe that has something to do, but I don't fully understand. Sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, we could say whether we want to talk about the reasons as the thing represented or it was as the representings. I mean, I think we can divide through by that, because Boyle can do, everyone can do the same in the debate and either talk about the thing represented or the representings. So I don't think that should matter. But what I do think matters is that for him, he has the thing about the interaction problem and the unity problem, and those are both things that have to do with the states playing the role of supporting other states, either by themselves being reasons or by representing reasons, however we want to talk about that. And then, if they're good reasons, they might be facts at the end of the day, right? But so I think that it does, for him, it is the case that these roles characterize the nature of the things because of the whole Magdalenian thing. So my worry is that you don't really get around the whole, to face up to the whole Magdalenian stuff, because I'm thinking that what he thinks, what Boyle thinks, is that these things serve as support, like as reasons, and then McDowell thinks they have to be conceptual in order to do that, because otherwise our faculty of reason couldn't take them in the right way, and they have to be special because otherwise they couldn't stand in this kind of relation of supporting consideration. Now you might not buy any of that, right? But I think that was the view that I understood Boyle to put forward. Maybe I misunderstood that.
No, I think I would have to look into that. I think it's a good point. I don't really have, I don't really know what to say about it now. It's something that I should look at. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I'm seeing from the bottom right corner there, it's 11:16, so we are 1 minute over already. Let us thank Yannick. And
Thank you.
we will reconvene sharply